He wrote his last letter on a piece of torn canvas, using charcoal from a burned-out tank. Private First Class Michael Sullivan knew he wouldn't survive the next morning's assault on Hill 875 in Vietnam. He'd seen the reconnaissance reports. He'd counted the enemy positions. He'd done the math. "Dear Mom," he began, his hands steady despite everything. The night air hung thick with humidity and the distant sound of mortars. Around him, 19 other soldiers prepared for what they all knew was coming, but only Michael had accepted it fully. Only he had made peace with the dawn that would never break for him. 3 days earlier, his unit had been ambushed near Dak To. Half the company was gone in minutes. The survivors had regrouped, waiting for reinforcements that would never come. Command needed Hill 875 taken. The North Vietnamese army had turned it into a fortress. Someone had to go. Michael volunteered to lead the assault team. His sergeant had pulled him aside. "You don't have to do this, Sullivan. You've got 2 weeks left on your tour. 2 weeks and you're home free." But Michael had already seen what needed to be seen. In war, someone always pays the price. This time, he chose to be the one who paid it. He folded the letter carefully, placing it in his breast pocket. Tomorrow, someone would find it. Tomorrow, his mother would learn that her son had known exactly what he was walking into, and that he'd walked anyway. The stars above Vietnam looked nothing like the stars above Iowa, but Michael stared at them all the same, memorizing their positions. These would be his last stars. He wanted to remember them. In 6 hours, the assault would begin. In 6 hours, 20 young men would charge up a hill that had already claimed hundreds. But because of what Michael Sullivan was about to do, 19 of them would come home. He closed his eyes and let the jungle sounds wash over him. Somewhere in the darkness, a nightbird called out. Somewhere else, an enemy soldier was probably writing his own last letter. War made philosophers of them all in the end. The letter in Michael's pocket wasn't his first attempt. He'd started writing it a dozen times over the past 3 days, each version torn up and scattered to the monsoon winds. How do you tell your mother you're choosing to die? How do you explain that sometimes one life can save 20? He thought back to his childhood in Cedar Rapids, baseball in the summer, his mother's apple pie cooling on the windowsill, his little sister Sarah learning to ride a bike, Michael running behind her, promising he'd never let go. Promises were different in war. Here, the only promise that mattered was the one you made to the man beside you. Corporal Danny Chen sat next to him in the darkness, checking his rifle for the 100th time. Danny was 19, from San Francisco's Chinatown. He'd joined up because his grandfather had fought with the 442nd Regiment in World War II. Most decorated unit in U.S. military history, Danny would say proudly. All Japanese American. They fought for a country that had locked up their families. Danny understood sacrifice, but he was 19, he deserved to see 20. Michael had studied the enemy positions through binoculars until his eyes burned. The NVA had 3 machine gun nests covering the only approach to the summit. Interlocking fields of fire, no cover for the last 100 yards. Military science said you needed a 3-to-1 advantage to take a fortified position. They had 20 men to the enemy's 60. But Michael had noticed something the others hadn't. A drainage ditch on the north side, barely visible through the jungle growth, too exposed for a full assault. But one man, moving fast enough, might make it close enough to the first machine gun position. One man with enough grenades might create enough chaos for the others to advance. He'd done the calculations over and over. One man would die, 19 would live. In war, that was the best math you could hope for. The previous evening, he'd walked among his men, memorizing their faces. Private Williams from Detroit, who sent half his pay home to his grandmother. Specialist Rodriguez from El Paso, whose wife was 8 months pregnant with their first child. Lieutenant Morrison, fresh out of West Point, still believing he could change the world. They all had reasons to live. They all had people waiting for them. Michael's reason was simpler. He'd already lost too many friends in this war. He couldn't lose 19 more. Not when he could prevent it. Not when the arithmetic of survival was so clear. He pulled out the letter one more time, reading it by the faint moonlight. He'd kept it simple in the end. No grand statements about duty or country. Just the truth. I knew what I had to do and I did it. Take care of Sarah. Tell her I kept my promise. I never let go. Dawn came like a thief, stealing the last moments of peace. The jungle shifted from black to gray, shadows becoming trees, trees becoming targets. Michael checked his watch. 05:30 hours. 30 minutes until the assault. 30 minutes left of Michael Sullivan from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He'd dreamed of his father last night. Strange, because his father had been dead for 10 years, killed in a factory accident when Michael was 12. In the dream, his father was teaching him to fish at the Cedar River, just like when he was a boy. "Patience, Mike," his father had said. "Everything good requires patience and sacrifice." Around him, the squad began their final preparations, weapons cleaned, ammunition distributed, last letters home tucked safely away. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before, but their eyes betrayed them. Everyone knew Hill 875's reputation, the meat grinder, the widowmaker. Lieutenant Morrison called the squad leaders together for a final briefing. Michael listened with half an ear. He already knew the plan. More importantly, he knew how the plan would fail. The lieutenant was a good man, but he'd been in country for only 6 weeks. He still believed in tactical manuals and fire superiority. He hadn't yet learned that in jungle warfare, death came from angles you couldn't calculate. "Sullivan, you'll take point," Morrison said. It wasn't a question. Michael always took point. He had a gift for reading the jungle, for sensing danger before it materialized. He'd saved the squad more times than anyone could count. This would be the last time. Danny Chen pressed something into Michael's hand. A small jade Buddha, worn smooth by generations of handling. "My grandmother gave it to me," Danny said quietly. "For protection." Michael wanted to give it back, to tell Danny he'd need it more. But he saw the look in the younger man's eyes. Danny knew. Somehow, they all knew. The radio crackled to life. "Eagle 6, this is Thunder. Artillery commencing in 5 minutes. Good hunting." The preparatory bombardment would soften up the hill, or so the theory went. In reality, the NVA bunkers were too well constructed. The shells would do little more than announce their arrival. Michael made his final rounds, a word here, a nod there. To Private Williams, "Keep your head down and follow Rodriguez." To Rodriguez, "Take care of the new guys." To each man, a specific instruction, as if he were planning to check on their progress later. The lying came easy now. In war, kindness often wore the mask of deception. He touched the letter in his pocket one last time. His mother would understand eventually. She'd raised him to protect others, to stand up for those who couldn't stand for themselves. She just never imagined it would cost everything. The first artillery round screamed overhead, impacting on the hillside with thunderous roars. The assault on Hill 875 had begun. Michael Sullivan had 23 minutes left to live. The artillery barrage lifted, leaving behind the acrid smell of cordite and the ringing silence that always followed heavy bombardment. Michael gave the hand signal, and 20 men rose from the jungle floor like ghosts, beginning their climb toward destiny. The first 50 yards were deceptively easy. The jungle provided cover, and the enemy held their fire, waiting for the Americans to enter the killing zone. Michael had seen this tactic before. Let them come, let them hope. Then cut them down. When retreat became impossible, he thought of his sister Sarah as he moved through the undergrowth. She'd be 16 now, probably dating some boy their mother didn't approve of. He'd promised to intimidate all her boyfriends when he got home, to play the protective older brother. Another promise he wouldn't keep, but maybe that was okay. Sarah was strong. She'd learned that from watching their mother hold the family together after their father died. The terrain began to change. The trees thinned out, replaced by elephant grass and scattered rocks. They were entering the approaches to the summit. Michael could feel the enemy watching, fingers on triggers, waiting for the perfect moment. He spotted the drainage ditch he'd identified earlier, angling off to the right, his path to the first machine gun nest. Behind him, Danny Chen whispered a prayer in Cantonese. Private Williams hummed something under his breath. Maybe a hymn, maybe a Motown tune. Each man found his own way to face the approaching storm. The first burst of machine gun fire shattered the morning air, green tracers slicing through the space where Michael had been standing a second before. He'd anticipated it, diving left while shouting, "Contact front, take cover!" The squad scattered, finding whatever protection the meager landscape offered. This was the moment. While the enemy focused on the main group, Michael could make his move. He caught Lieutenant Morrison's eye, pointed to the ditch, held up one finger. Morrison started to shake his head, then stopped. He understood. Someone had to break the stalemate. Michael shed his pack, keeping only his rifle, ammunition, and grenades. Every pound mattered now. Speed would be his only armor. He touched the jade Buddha Danny had given him, thought of his mother's face, his father's patient smile, Sarah's laugh. Then he was moving. The ditch was shallower than it had appeared through binoculars, offering barely 18 inches of concealment. Michael crawled on his belly, pushing with his toes, pulling with his elbows. Bullets cracked overhead as the firefight intensified. He could hear Morrison directing fire, trying to keep the enemy's heads down. 70 yards. 50. 30. The first machine gun position was just ahead, its muzzle flashes visible through the grass. Michael could see the gunner's helmet, the loader feeding ammunition. They hadn't spotted him yet. Their attention remained fixed on the main squad. He pulled the pin on his first grenade, counted to 2, and threw. The explosion rocked the enemy position, but the gun kept firing. These weren't conscripts. These were North Vietnamese regulars, disciplined and determined. It would take more than one grenade to silence them. That's when the gunner spotted him. Time fractured into heartbeats. The machine gunner swung his weapon toward Michael, bark and dirt exploding around him as bullets sought his life. Michael rolled right, pulled another grenade, threw it in one fluid motion born of desperate necessity. The second explosion was closer, showering the gun position with shrapnel. The firing stopped for a moment, just a moment, but it was enough. Michael was on his feet, charging the remaining 20 yards with his rifle at his hip, firing as he ran. He reached the edge of the position just as the assistant gunner was bringing up a rifle. They fired simultaneously. Michael felt the bullet punch through his side, spinning him half around. But his momentum carried him forward into the gun pit, where close combat became intimate combat. The fight was brief and brutal. When it ended, Michael was alone among the dead, bleeding from 3 wounds, the captured machine gun in his hands. He turned it toward the second enemy position and opened fire, buying precious seconds for his squad. "Move, move, move!" he heard Morrison shouting. Through the smoke and chaos, Michael saw his squad advancing, using the distraction he'd created. Danny Chen led the way, that 19-year-old kid from Chinatown charging up a hill in Vietnam because Michael Sullivan had given him the chance. The enemy reacted quickly, bringing mortar fire down on Michael's position. The ground erupted around him, steel fragments filling the air like angry hornets. He kept firing even as his vision blurred, even as his strength ebbed away. A mortar round landed directly in the gun pit. The explosion lifted Michael off his feet, slamming him into the earthen wall. He couldn't feel his legs anymore. His hands were slick with blood, his own blood, but he could still see the squad advancing, could still see them moving toward the second position. He dragged himself to the machine gun, managed to fire another burst before his arms gave out. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard American voices getting closer. They were going to make it. The math was working out exactly as he'd calculated. Michael fumbled for the letter in his breast pocket. Still there, though soaked with blood now. His mother would receive it. Sarah would know her brother had kept his promise to protect others. His father would have been proud. The third enemy position tried to bring its gun to bear on the advancing Americans, but the angle was wrong. They designed their defense to stop a frontal assault, not to deal with Americans who'd broken through the first line. Morrison was screaming into the radio, calling for support. Reinforcements would come now. The hill would fall. Michael tried to reload the machine gun, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate anymore. The jade Buddha had fallen from his pocket, landing in the dirt beside him. He picked it up with trembling hands, remembering Danny's grandmother, a woman he'd never met who'd sent protection across an ocean for American boys fighting in a war she probably didn't understand. More explosions, more gunfire. But it was moving away from him now up the hill. The squad was pushing through. 19 men who would see another sunrise because one man had chosen not to. The fighting had moved past Michael's position, leaving him in a pocket of relative quiet. He could hear the battle raging above, American voices mixing with Vietnamese, the sharp crack of M16s answering the deeper bark of AK-47s. But for him, the war was ending. He thought about time, how strange it became when you were dying. Minutes stretched like hours, yet hours compressed into heartbeats. He'd been in Vietnam for 11 months and 14 days. He'd seen monsoons turn roads into rivers, seen the jungle reclaim fire bases overnight, seen boys become men in the space between bullets. His first kill had been on a patrol near Pleiku. He'd thrown up afterward, hands shaking so badly he couldn't light a cigarette. Sergeant Rodriguez, a different Rodriguez, one who didn't make it home, had sat with him. "It never gets easier," the sergeant had said. "It just gets more necessary." Now Michael understood what he'd meant. Every action in war carried weight. Every decision rippled outward like stones thrown in still water. He'd chosen to throw the biggest stone he could. The letter in his pocket seemed to pulse with its own life. He'd written about the small things, how the rain in Vietnam smelled different from Iowa rain, how he'd learned to sleep standing up during long patrols, how the stars looked the same from both sides of the world, proof that all men lived under the same sky. He'd written about the men he served with. How Private Thompson from Alabama had taught him to play harmonica. How Corporal Johnson from Michigan could make coffee from anything, roots, bark, even boot leather in desperate times. How they'd become brothers not by blood, but by choice, bound together by shared danger and mutual trust. A figure appeared at the edge of the gun pit. Danny Chen, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, but alive, gloriously, impossibly alive. "Medic!" Danny screamed. "Medic! Sullivan's hit!" Michael tried to wave him away. There was still fighting to do, and wasting time on a dead man wouldn't help anyone. But Danny was already sliding into the pit, pressing bandages against wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. "You crazy bastard," Danny said, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. "You beautiful crazy bastard. We made it through. All of us. Because of you." More faces appeared. Williams, Rodriguez, even Lieutenant Morrison with his West Point ring still somehow shining despite the mud and blood. They'd taken the second position. The third was falling. Hill 875 would be American by nightfall. "The letter," Michael managed to say. "In my pocket. For my mother." Danny found it, carefully extracted it from the blood-soaked pocket. "I'll make sure she gets it," he promised. "I'll deliver it personally if I have to." Michael wanted to thank him, but words were becoming difficult. The jungle was fading, replaced by something else. A river. Cedar River, where his father had taught him to fish. The water was clear and cool, and somewhere on the far bank someone was waiting for him. The medic arrived, but his eyes told the story, his mouth wouldn't speak. He went through the motions anyway. Morphine for the pain, bandages for wounds that had already done their work. Michael appreciated the effort. In war, rituals mattered. They separated men from chaos. Around him, the squad formed a protective circle. The battle for Hill 875 continued above them, but for these few minutes, 19 men stood vigil for the one who'd made their survival possible. Michael could see it in their faces, the guilt of the living, the weight of unpayable debt. He wanted to tell them it was okay, that this was his choice, that every man in the circle would have done the same if they'd seen what he'd seen, known what he'd known. But breathing took all his effort now, and words were luxury he couldn't afford. Lieutenant Morrison knelt beside him, his academy training warring with battlefield reality. "You're going to be fine, Sullivan. Dust-off's inbound. 5 minutes." They both knew it was a lie. The nearest landing zone was 20 minutes away, and Michael didn't have 20 minutes. He had moments. Michael thought about lies, how they could be acts of kindness. His mother had lied when his father died, telling him and Sarah that Daddy hadn't suffered, that it had been quick. He'd learned later about the 3 hours his father had lived after the accident, conscious and in agony, but the lie had helped 2 children sleep at night. He'd told his own lies in this war. Letters home that spoke of easy patrols and good food, of friendly villages and beautiful sunsets. Never mentioning the ambushes, the hunger, the villages that vanished overnight, the sunsets obscured by burning helicopters. His mother didn't need those truths. She needed a son who was okay, even when he wasn't. The morphine was working now, wrapping him in cotton wool, muting the pain to a distant thunder. He could hear a helicopter somewhere, but it sounded wrong. Not the rhythmic whoop-whoop of a Huey, but something else. Wings. His father had loved birds, could identify them by their songs. He'd tried to teach Michael, but boys had little patience for such things. Strange, the things you regretted at the end. Not the big choices, but the small ones, the songs unlearned, the letters unwritten, the words unsaid. He'd never told his father he loved him, not in words. Men didn't do that in Iowa, not in the 1950s. Love was shown in other ways, in teaching your son to fish, in working double shifts to pay for school supplies. in dying at a machine trying to earn Christmas money. Tell my mom, Michael said, surprised he could still speak. Tell her I understood. About Dad. About sacrifice. Tell her I understood. Danny squeezed his hand. I'll tell her everything. I promise. The helicopter sound was louder now. Not mechanical at all, but organic, like a great bird descending. Michael could see its shadow falling across the gun pit, across the faces of 19 men who would live to see their families again. The official after-action report would be clinical, reducing Michael Sullivan's last stand to military terminology: 1 KIA, 3 enemy KIA, 1 machine gun position neutralized, Hill 875 secured, numbers on a page filed away in some Pentagon basement. But the 19 men who survived knew different truths. They knew about the letter written on torn canvas. They knew about the drainage ditch no one else had noticed. They knew about the math of sacrifice. 1 life weighed against 19. The terrible arithmetic of war that someone had to calculate and Michael had chosen to solve. They would carry these truths home with them. Danny Chen would wake up in San Francisco 20 years later, still clutching his grandmother's jade Buddha, remembering a farm boy from Iowa who'd given it back to him with bloody hands. For your children, Michael had whispered. Private Williams would name his first son Michael. He'd tell the boy stories about bravery that had nothing to do with wanting to be a hero, and everything to do with loving the men beside you more than you feared death. He'd teach his son that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Rodriguez would become a teacher in El Paso, spending 30 years trying to explain to teenagers why history mattered. Every Veterans Day, he'd tell the story of Hill 875. Not the sanitized version from textbooks, but the real one, about a 22-year-old who'd done calculus with human lives and made the hardest equation balance. Lieutenant Morrison would stay in the Army, rising to full colonel before retiring. He'd write a book about leadership, dedicating it to the best point man I ever served with, who taught me that sometimes leading means choosing to go where others can't follow. He'd never mention Michael by name. Some sacrifices were too personal for public consumption. The letter would reach Cedar Rapids 2 weeks after the official telegram. Danny Chen, true to his word, would deliver it personally, still in uniform, still carrying Vietnam mud on his boots. He'd sit in Mary Sullivan's kitchen, drinking coffee and telling her about her son's last days. She'd read the letter aloud, her voice steady until the final lines. I've seen the sunrise from the other side of the world, and it looks just like home. Different trees, same light. Different ground, same earth. We're all connected, Mom. By sunrise and sunset, by love and loss, by the choices we make and the prices we pay. I'm paying mine gladly. Kiss Sarah for me. Tell her some promises are worth everything. The local paper would run a story. There'd be a memorial service at First Presbyterian, a folded flag, a marker in Cedar Rapids Cemetery. But the real memorial lived in 19 families who got their boys back, in children born to fathers who almost didn't make it home, in lives lived fully because one man chose to end his own. This was Michael Sullivan's math. Not glory or medals, but futures secured, possibilities preserved. On a hill in Vietnam, he'd balanced an equation that could never really balance, had solved for X when X meant everything. Years would pass. Decades. The war would end, leaving scars on a nation and wounds in hearts. But stories like Michael's would endure, passed from father to son, from survivor to student, carrying truths too important to forget. Sarah Sullivan Morrison, she'd married one of her brother's high school friends, would become a nurse, drawn to healing by her brother's sacrifice. She'd work in VA hospitals, caring for men whose eyes carried the same distance her brother's had in his last letter home. She'd learn their names, their stories, understanding that every patient was someone's Michael. She'd keep the letter in a safe deposit box, bringing it out only on significant occasions. Her children's graduations, their weddings, the day her eldest son enlisted, following a tradition of service he'd inherited from an uncle he'd never met. She'd read it to him then, making sure he understood the weight of the uniform he was choosing to wear. The hill itself would return to jungle within years, nature reclaiming what man had briefly borrowed. Vines would cover the gun positions. Rain would wash away the brass casings, but the earth would remember. In places where blood had soaked deep, the grass would grow differently, marking spots where boys had become statistics and statistics had become stories. Veterans would make pilgrimages sometimes. Not many. The hill was remote, difficult to reach, but a few would come, usually alone, always quiet. They'd stand where young men had died for ground that no longer mattered, understanding that the ground had never really been the point. One visitor left a note weighted down with a stone, for Sullivan, who did the math. From all of us who didn't have to. In America, his name would appear on a wall in Washington. Line 31, panel 32E. Just one name among 58,000. Visitors would trace their fingers across the letters, most not knowing the story, just feeling the loss. But occasionally someone would pause longer. A child or grandchild of the 19, come to pay respects to the reason they existed. Danny Chen would bring his daughter when she turned 18. He'd help her make a rubbing of the name, tell her the story he'd told her a dozen times before. But this time, with her fingers on those carved letters, she'd understand differently. Her very existence, her dreams, her plans, her future, had been purchased on a hill she'd never see by a man she'd never meet. The jade Buddha would sit in a place of honor in Danny's home, no longer carried but never forgotten. Sometimes he'd hold it, feeling its smooth surface, remembering bloody hands pressing it back into his palm. "For your children," Michael had said. Danny had 3 children, 7 grandchildren. All of them existed because of one man's choice to solve an impossible equation. This multiplication of lives, this exponential growth of possibilities, this was Michael Sullivan's true legacy. Not the medal they'd awarded posthumously, not the memorial plaque in Cedar Rapids, but the lived experiences of everyone who came after. Every birthday celebrated, every wedding dance, every quiet Sunday morning that 19 families enjoyed. All interest paid on a debt that could never be fully calculated. War asks terrible questions. Who lives? Who dies? What's worth dying for? What's worth killing for? Most soldiers go their entire service without having to answer these questions definitely. Michael Sullivan answered them all in one morning on a hill whose name most Americans couldn't pronounce. He answered them not with words, but with action. Not with philosophy, but with physics. The angle of approach through a drainage ditch. The trajectory of grenades. The time it took for 19 men to cover open ground while one man drew fire. Mathematics applied to mortality, producing an answer written in blood and validated by survival. His story echoes through time because it speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit. Not the manufactured heroism of movies, where death is clean and motives are pure, but the messy, complicated, calculated heroism of real life, where someone has to count the cost and decide to pay it. Every war produces these stories, men and women who see clearly the price of survival and choose to pay it for others. They don't do it for glory. Glory is for the living. They don't do it for country. Abstractions fade when bullets fly. They do it for the person next to them, for the 19 faces they've memorized, for the futures they can save by sacrificing their own. Michael Sullivan was 22 years old. He'd lived through 8,030 days, seen 1,147 sunrises, written one last letter. In the span of 37 minutes on Hill 875, he compressed a lifetime of meaning into a single morning, transforming himself from a farm boy from Iowa into an equation that balanced 19 lives against one. His mother would live to be 93, keeping his letter in her nightstand until the end. She'd read it sometimes in the dark, fingers tracing words she'd memorized decades ago. "I knew what I had to do, and I did it." Simple words that carried the weight of all the sunrises her son would never see, all the choices he'd never make, all the life he'd compressed into one final act. But she'd also see her daughter grow up, marry, have children. She'd watch Danny Chen bring his family to visit, see 19 young men become middle-aged, then old, carrying their survival like a responsibility. She'd understand that her son's death had purchased all of this, a terrible transaction, but one that honored both the living and the dead. This is the truth about sacrifice. It multiplies. One life freely given becomes 19 lives fully lived. 19 becomes hundreds as families grow. Hundreds become thousands as generations unfold. The mathematics of sacrifice defies normal arithmetic, creating abundance from loss, meaning from grief. Michael Sullivan lies in Cedar Rapids Cemetery, his grave marked by a simple stone. But his real memorial walks the earth in every descendant of the 19, breathes in every life made possible by his death. He is the grandfather who wasn't there, but somehow was. The empty chair at Thanksgiving that's somehow full. The absence that creates presence. Some might call it tragedy. Others might call it heroism. Michael would have called it math, the only equation that mattered. The only answer that counted. Hill 875 stands empty now, returned to jungle, forgotten by all but a few. But on certain mornings, when the mist rises from the valleys and the sun breaks through the canopy, you can almost see them. 20 young men climbing toward the summit. 19 destined to grow old, 1 destined to ensure it. This is their story. This is our story. This is the story of every generation that sends its children to answer terrible questions with their lives. Some come home, some don't. But all of them, in their way, solve the unbearable equations that history demands. Remember them. Remember Michael Sullivan, who did the math. Remember the 19 who lived because of it. Remember that somewhere in every war someone is calculating the same terrible arithmetic, preparing to balance the books with their own blood. Like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. This channel is for those who believe history is made not only by armies, but by individuals.